Welcome everyone to Turn 2, a podcast about Hearthstone. Everything Hearthstone, whether it's cards, meta, or even drama on the scene. My name's Chobra, the new host starting last week actually, so if you missed that episode, go tune in for our chat with Freshca and Apdrod. But today, we do have, of course, none other than Brian Kibler and Kaldi from Fnatic. And those of you guys who have been watching here on the Twitch channel, we were just on Tabletop and we started some discussions. So I want to go in, but for those who are catching the VOD on Turn 2, if we can just have quick introductions from both of you guys again. We'll start with Brian.
Sure. My name is Brian Kibler. I've been playing collectible card games for over 20 years now. I'm a professional gamer and game designer, and you may recognize my name from the Twitch chat spam that always seems to show up.
All right, and Kaldi, what about you?
My name is Jökull. I come from Iceland. Been playing StarCraft and chess for over 10 years. I started to play Hearthstone since beta and play for Team Fnatic now, and I'm just going full time as a player, starting soon.
Awesome. Good to hear. Yeah, both of you guys, of course, diving a lot more into Hearthstone now intensely, and so I think it's I'm really happy to have you guys on board. Now, last week, of course, we just focused heavily on GVG cards. It was just released, so with Freshca and Apdrod, we just got to break down certain cards. We had our favorite picks, maybe what we thought were the most flops. But right away, thankful to, of course, the beautiful community that Hearthstone has, we've already had some tournaments happen, and we've had metas develop. We've had more discussions go on. So I want to jump right into that. I think the biggest one is the Kinguin charity tournament that just happened over the weekend. And of course and this is something, again, we'll go back to and talk a lot with you about, Brian, because StrifeCro ends up winning the finals, goes 4-0 in the finals with the aggro mage deck, very mech heavy, and he credited you for kind of the foundation of that deck, just made a couple of tweaks, he said later in an interview. But both of you guys, first of all, what did you think about the tournament? Did it feel different because of GVG? I think the basic answer is yes, but I want to get your takes on it.
Yeah, I think that big competitive events right after the release of a new set in a collectible game are really the most exciting time for any game. We saw not only sort of mech-focused decks like the one that StrifeCro used to win the finals, but also just a variety of different decks experimenting with new cards from the new set. So definitely shook things up quite a bit.
Yeah, it felt a lot more consistent. It seemed like the player that put more work into it and had better planning came out ahead. It felt more predictable, definitely, and less random, which is a good thing, I'd say, for sure.
All right, so let's just right back to the mage deck, right? It got a lot of attention because, of course, it was the last deck that was played. It went 4-0 in the finals. StrifeCro, of course, a very well-known player in the Hearthstone community, and then crediting you for that basis. A lot of people had read your write-up before that with that mage deck. So let's start with you, Brian. First of all, how did you feel that met with such success at Kinguin?
It was really cool. I actually didn't hear about it until afterwards. People were like, oh, StrifeCro credited you with the deck that he used to win the tournament, and I went and looked at it. And I was like, oh, that's pretty sweet. I had just been sort of working on various builds of mech decks on my stream, and each day sort of going through different iterations, and ultimately ended up posting a bunch of them on my website. It was neat to see that it wasn't just the people in my stream chat who cared about it and that had an impact in the competitive scene as well. So
pretty awesome. Kaldi, what about you? Of course, Brian had a different kind of look on it, of course, because he kind of started the move on that aggro mech mage. But for you, having heard about that, did you just think, it's kind of new, right? First of all, mechs in general are new. The aggro mage doing well is kind of new to hear in tournament settings. What did you think about that news?
I think the mech mage is quite strong at the moment. I felt, for example, the one that Twixen made was quite innovative. He used Ice Lances to proc with Antonidas. He used Blingtron and had a lot of freeze with Water Elementals and Chugger. So if you give the opponent the weapon with Blingtron and then you just keep on freezing him. So I think, but yeah, the StrifeCro deck was definitely very consistent. Mid-range felt a lot like his Shaman and his Paladin. Gets a lot of pressure in early and then has some finishers there. Yeah.
Right on. Now, also, I want to talk about, again, Kingdom being one of the bigger tournaments that happened right after the release. Were there any other decks that kind of caught your attention of, oh, well, that's something we could never have seen without GVG, or that's something I didn't even think about trying myself out of the deck list, if you got a chance to review over them?
Well, could never have seen without GVG would be a winning Paladin deck, maybe. And there were quite a few of those. Paladin was actually
Right.
quite a popular deck amongst the competitors at the Kingdom event when, there was one Paladin deck or two Paladin decks in the whole of the World Championships at BlizzCon. So definitely that class in general got a big shot in the arm from GVG with cards like Muster for Battle, Coghammer, Quartermaster, things like that.
I think a mage as well. Like when you used to run into mage, it was almost always freeze mage, I guess, before GVG. There were some secret decks that I sometimes played, but it was mostly only freeze mage. So seeing so many mages as well is quite cool. I found in particular running Jeeves and Sue. Tides of Time did that. That was quite cool. And there was also Nyria. He ran Blessing of Wisdom in Paladin, a card that I've been looking at for probably 6 or 7 months now, really wanted to use. And every time I play Paladin, I really want to use Blessing of Wisdom if it fits in. So I found that really cool.
I had not seen that. That's really cool. You playing with like Shield Bot, mini Shielded Bot or whatever it is?
I guess also just offensively, like you can really shut down big cards like,
Sure.
let's say you play against a druid and he plays a cairn or whatever, and you just ruin the cairn, because I mean, what you're gonna do, silence it, then you silence the cairn and it's ruined
Sure.
completely. So yeah.
It's actually my least
Yeah.
favorite use of Blessing of Wisdom is put it on your opponent's guy. Not that I don't. It's not a powerful play, but I think it feels so lame when you do that. It's like,
Oh yeah.
it's a blessing. You play in your own guy. Come on.
Yep. Now, of course, another tournament that's been going on and getting a lot of attention is the ESL Legendary Series, now in week 4. That got attention in the beginning for a variety of reasons, including different tournament format. But before we go to that, one thing I want to point out is, now week 4, of course, was the first one with GVG cards for that tournament. And in there, for Weifu, the player who won week 4, his Hunter deck, if I recall correctly, had no GVG cards in it. And now that's something people have been discussing mainly with Control Warrior, right? It's just a couple different flavor cards, that's it. And Hunter's been getting a little bit of that attention too. But do you think this speaks to the fact that maybe GVG isn't bringing that much of an impact for some of the classes, or this is just a conscious choice that Weifu made, that this has been working for so long that it's just a little bit more consistent?
I think a big thing is, for example, the Druid has very few differences. The Handlock, only 4 or 5 cards, but it seems like the pros really, want to try something new and really are quite aggressively testing stuff out. So even though some stuff might not be quite as good, they still want to test it out just to get it out of the way, So, I mean, with the aggro Hunter, it seems like the Call Path Hunter isn't really working well. So then it just comes down to the aggro. And I mean, the only new card that really works into that is maybe the Glaive Suka, but I mean, if you look at the Glaive Suka, the bow is just as good, if not better, I mean, I'm kind of like one Glaive Suka, maybe 2 bows or 1 bow, but it's definitely not needed at all, not as consistent, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's 2 major ways that when you're looking at building decks after a new set. And one is looking at, okay, what's the big new theme of this set that I can build around? And clearly in Goblins versus Gnomes, that was mechs. And so, you see decks like the Mech Mage deck that Strife Crow won with, sort of based on my build. And my goal there was, okay, what can I do to exploit these new mech synergies as much as possible? It ends up using Tinkertown, Cogmaster, Mech Warper, Blast Mage, all these things built around mechs. The other way is, okay, well, I know this existing deck is good. What new cards exist that fit into this? And if you're playing a Beast Hunter deck, there aren't really all that many new cards from Goblins versus Gnomes that necessarily slot in. And like you're saying, maybe Warrior's playing Dr. Boom or Shield Maiden or something, but your sort of basic shell is there, and a lot of the Goblins versus Gnome cards are based in these sort of mech synergies and things and don't necessarily fit.
Right, yeah. And of course, it's still only been a week too. Even within this week, I've seen a lot of different changes. Just previously on Deck Wars, and we saw the Shaman come out for Zixo doing very well, but then Rogue actually doing really well for Host. He ended up getting him the win with a reverse Alco 4-0. So it's still very early on in the phase, but it was just interesting to see how much it developed within a week. So that's something I want to touch upon. Also with the Legendary Series, I think something we have to touch upon. I forgot to mention this in my show notes, but the different tournament format they first announced, the fact that, and this is something we touched upon on the tabletop, we're not really sure if everyone is on board with the whole last hero standing format. It doesn't really relate to ladder, and also a lot of people have been saying now it just becomes about who can bring out more counter decks, right? It's not about who can play their decks the best, but really like, well, I have these counters, and I'm going to ban that one counter that probably is the last standing on your list, and that way I can win the game. How do you feel about the format at ESL where you just say, I'm going to play in this order, these 3 decks, boom, 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 and then you just go into, I guess, an unknown matchup?
I like it a lot. I played in the ESL Legendary Series a couple weeks ago. I think it was not this past weekend before, and I actually lost in the finals to Silent Storm there. But I feel like the experience of that is much more similar to the average player's experience playing on ladder. Because you just have to have good decks. You're not like, it's not, this is my deck to beat Warrior, this is my deck to beat Hunter, and this is my sort of starting deck or whatever combination. And I also, in particular, really hate bans. I think bans are like a super like weird reaction, overreaction to how good Miracle was for a while, from what I understand, basically. And it just, like if someone has a really cool deck and the fact that it can just get banned out of a tournament just feels super lame to me. And you end up stifling innovation in that way. And I think that the format that ESL uses both it means that you're going to see a variety of decks because everyone's bringing multiple different decks. And you also end up having an experience and decks that come out of it that are much more applicable to the average viewer who primarily plays on ladder. That's a big thing that you see in Last Year Standing is, okay, well, there's only 1 or 2 real aggressive classes, or at least there used to be, when it was pretty much Hunter and Warlock or the possible aggressive deck. And if you just ban one of them, that you're going to play against mostly control decks. So you can have these super biased decks that are just not realistic ladder decks. So they're not really meaningful for players who are watching.
Absolutely. I definitely do agree. What about you, Kaldi?
Well, it becomes a lot about just planning it out. Like, we saw a lot of a long time people were redoing Handlock over and over and over and over because it had so many reactionary cards needed to beat Handlock. I feel like if there are certain uses for the ban though. Like let's say now that we go for I've been playing a lot of these 8-man tournaments, practice tournaments with some of my practice partners, and it feels like often in the constructed now the one who wins the Handlock mirror almost wins the best of 5, and it would become even more random if you play these 3 decks in this order, but it's really hard without the ban. It becomes just a Handlock fest completely. With the ban, there's a lot of more variety I found, with Pala coming in strong and Warrior doing well, and even seeing some Mage and I guess Priest. But so I think the ban has its place, but I think other formats could be quite cool. I like the one that I did with Viagame where you had to play all different classes because a player should be able to display not just three or so decks, because you have some players that are working full time or something, and then they have practice partners that set them up with the decks that are popular that week, and then they play these decks 3 or 4 months ago. So it is kind of possible in the best of 5 scenario to essentially just have handed to you 4 or 5 of the decks that are being without even having played that week. So I think 8 or 9 class formats like they had at Viacom is quite cool.
Right on. At OGN when we did the Korea China Masters, right, we had people submit 9 decks, and then but we allowed them to have some repeats, but obviously you couldn't play the repeats. But in some ways that actually favored having more counters. So in the end, there was a lot of review to be done about that, and we'll see how that changes for even the Korean scene next year. But speaking about different formats, and I'm glad we could actually get a little bit of a different opinion from both of you. And this one, I'm going to assume I know the answer, but as players, now, would you prefer that these tournaments continue to offer maybe slight changes or variety of methods for, I guess, just like freshness of the tournament scene? Or would you prefer, no, like we should really just have a standard rolling for every tournament, even if they don't feed into the official Blizzard circuit?
I definitely think a variety is cool. As someone coming from the Magic tournament scene, there's a bunch of different formats that tournaments are run in both small tournaments and major tournaments. For instance, the Magic World Championships recently, it was the tournament itself was 4 separate formats. You had to play 2 different draft type formats, which is sort of similar to Arena, and then 2 different constructed formats with different pools of cards that are legal. And as Kaldi was saying, having a variety of formats over which you have to express mastery means that someone can't just come in with one good deck and happen to do well. I do think there's something to be said for players being experts of a particular class or strategy or whatever. And I think that there's a lot of sort of story value to that. It's like, oh well, Amaz playing Priest, Strifeco playing Druid, and if you see tournaments where those two are just not playing those decks, it's like, well, something feels wrong with this from a viewer perspective. But I do think as a player, having a variety of different formats is definitely keeps things fresh and exciting.
Right.
We kind of had this similar problem in chess where people just learned the first 30 moves over and over again, and it became very draw dependent because people were just playing the same thing over and over and over again. And Bobby Fischer actually came up with a solution to that, which was assigning the non-king queen pieces randomly each game. It was the same format, for both players, but it was just done on the spot. So you couldn't really just force yourself through with memorizing all these openings. It was more about just adapting on the spot and being good with the game mechanics. And I think it's perfect to go for that really. Like I'm not sure how you do it really. You maybe need, I guess, let's say the via game format, where you pick what deck your opponent plays and then he picks what deck you play, and then you see all of the 9 classes really come out there. So maybe even a random class. Let's say you bring in 9 decks and you have to play a random class, and it's generated every single game. And I think that might be quite cool. So for both you and your opponent,
Yeah, I mean that's that's something. For instance, I guess that accounts to the RNG in the game itself, right? It's like if the RNG applies to both players, technically it's fair. But then, of course, there's different arguments to be made there. But in the end, I'm glad to hear that both of you guys do like the idea of at least variety existing in the tournament scene. And I agree. Also, just because it's so, I think there's a lot of things that make Hearthstone different from other esports titles and even just general competitive titles in anything. But one being that it's very easy to set up these tournament settings, right? It can be done online, it can be done on LAN. Not everyone needs like an amazing computer or something like that. You don't need an amazing internet connection to play. So it is very accessible. So hopefully we'll see more of that. And until now, we have seen, I think, a healthy variety in tournament settings. So I might be happy to see that continue. So now that we've reviewed a little bit of the esports scene going on, and of course we'll have more to talk about that as weeks come by and the tournaments start rolling in once again with GVG. Let's start diving a little bit more about the meta, and then towards the end of the show we'll discuss game features and other just conversations and controversial discussions that have been happening in the community. So before we dive into the meta, of course we want to talk about maybe some decks we saw at the tournaments again. But for you guys, what's been your favorite class since GVG, and was it the same class you liked before GVG?
Yeah, I've played the most with Mage since GVG, and prior to GVG, I had never built a constructed Mage deck. I had 0 ranked wins on Mage.
Wow.
That's a pretty stark departure. I have like several gold classes and literally had 0 wins on Mage before this. So it's a pretty big difference for me.
That's pretty crazy.
I'm really loving the Paladin at the moment. It's a class that I almost never played before. I really like the potential with Mage and possibly even Rogue. But so far I've been liking the Paladin the most. And before it was definitely the Druid. That was my favorite class to go off that, yeah.
Right on. So Mage and Paladin, I think those, again, we touched upon them when we were talking about the decks we saw at tournaments. And I want to go back to that a little bit. We broke apart the aggro mage here in various ways, but then as I was watching Strifeco talk about it later on post tournament, he was also revealing a kind of control mage that he came up with, and expressing that personally he does prefer to play these games, even if they get drawn out, whether they're short or long, where each turn is a mind game, right? And I'm personally on board with that. Now, a couple interesting things here is that, for one, and I know Fireball, so no burn cards, if I remember correctly, and it also ran Explosive Sheep. Now, Explosive Sheep, I think, has been experimented with quite a bit, and Strife Crow mentioning that, well, you can just ping your own Explosive Sheep, and you can guarantee basically a Consecrate on the board that turn for 3 mana. What do you guys think about that? Have you had a chance to check this list? I didn't get a chance to link it for you guys, but
I did. I actually watched Strife Crow streaming a little bit with it. I think last night, and you know the deck looked pretty solid. It was performing pretty well. You know, in the sort of high tiers of Legendary, and it's definitely the kind of deck that, you know, I certainly think is pretty interesting. Like, you know, while I do really like playing aggressive decks and, you know, closing games out and pressuring my opponents, there's a certain allure to getting to play with all of the big powerful cards, like the dragons, for instance. But his deck doesn't have any dragons, but it still has some sweet powerful stuff in it.
right on. Right. So for the 4 mana, I mean, the board clear here for the mage. Now that's something, and therefore, you know, not running Flame Strikes or the Fireballs. What do you think about this deck in general and the sheep there for Strife Crow's idea?
It feels really cool. It's kind of close to what he was playing before the release with Zombie Chows and the Secrets, but it just seems better now, I'd say. I don't know. There's a lot of decks that can kind of do this. Play a lot more late game minions. There's definitely the Mage for one. The Shaman has a possibility of doing that now with the Ancestral Recall, and even the Druid. So I'm really liking these new sort of ramp decks. I think they're quite cool when people figure them out. The Sheep is definitely the way to go for that here. When I was playing the ramp Shaman, I guess earlier, I was definitely playing 2 Explosive Sheep because you just need so much AoE to make that work, because you don't have that constant curve, so you go behind a bit. Yeah.
I mean, one of the big things that makes a deck like this much more viable than prior to GVG isn't just the new cards, but also the nerf to Flare. The fact that Flare went from costing 1 mana and being pretty much an automatic inclusion in a lot of Hunter decks to, you know, something that you only really play if you're specifically trying to fight against Secrets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing that was brought up when discussing this deck with Strife Crow himself was that, you know, he, as do a lot of people, he prefers Dr. Boom as legendary, but puts Trouser in here over Dr. Boom. And he mentioned one of them being, well, I have duplicate in there, and do I really want to accidentally duplicate Boom bots? Probably not. I mean, they can be useful, but I'd rather duplicate something else, a bigger body. But not just in this deck, but in general, what do you think about that comparison? Trouser versus Dr. Boom, I think those are the 2 highlighted legendaries. And obviously, they serve different purposes, but what would you say? Kaldi earlier said that Dr. Boom seems to be more straightforward, but his Trouser may be a little bit better in a lot of situations.
It feels like it depends a lot on the situation of the board and kind of the deck. You know, like it feels like, you know, I mean, there's a comparison between the Sky Golem Cairn format, where you have a, you know, very sticky minion, and the potential of having a you know, a Sylvanas minion, which you have to have you have to basically be behind on the board to use effectively. You know. And it becomes quite interesting. Troxer compared to Dr. Boom is kind of similar to that. With Troxer, you really have to be ahead on the board. So it's quite strong in Druid, for example. If you get Troxer on the board and you know, he doesn't have enough minions to trade into it or weapons, etc., then you're just in big trouble, because you can't cast any spells realistically, except maybe, you know, you have a Molten Giant and Shadow Flame. But I think, I don't know. I'm not sure. I definitely like his reasoning with not having the duplicate on the bots, but it feels like you need more taunts to make Troxer effectively work, or I guess more ramp with possibly Innovate. Because, like, let's say on turn 7, you're probably behind with this deck, you know, against something like a Pala or a Su or whatever. So it would probably be Flame Strike into Troxer, but would that be super ideal? I'm not sure, because you will obviously play some stuff back and possibly able to trade into Troxer, so it's hard to say. Neither of them actually feel optimal for this deck. I don't know.
Huh.
I mean, Dr. Boom is a card that's going to consistently be, you know, it consistently does what it does. I mean, while there is obviously a random element to the Boom bots, it's, you know, going to have generally the same effect against most decks. Whereas Troxor, you know, against a lot of decks, like a minion heavy deck, Troxor just doesn't do anything. You know, you're just paying 7 mana for a 6/6 if your opponent is relying on playing to the board and doesn't have a lot of spells, which is just not a very good deal. You know, you'd rather have a Boulder Fist Ogre. So you know, I think that you know, in this deck, I sort of agree with Kaldi that it's not clear to me that this is the sort of thing that you necessarily want. But if you're playing against, say, a priest control deck and you're going to the late game, you know, you might really want to have a card like Trogzor that makes it really difficult for your opponent to come back with, you know, mind controls or Shadow or Deaths or whatever, because you're getting value no matter what they do.
Right
I
on.
feel like when I'm playing against handlock, for example, because there's a lot of handlocks on top of the European ladder. I've been really having a lot of success with Druid and Trogzor. You know, if you can get him out, it's really strong. And even like it comes to that situation where he's at like around 20 health and you're, you know, around full health, and you've kind of stopped his Mountain Giant Twilight Drake, and you kind of go into this, I guess, situation where you're at, you have him around 20 and you're waiting for the combo to get in your hands, and at that point Trogzor just becomes so strong because you can't cast Siphon Soul, and especially with taunts, Trogzor plus a taunt against the handlock is just a, you know, winning combination, it feels.
Now, another card, originally I didn't really think about bringing up, but earlier when you were playing your Priest deck, Brian, I saw in your mulligan was Sneed's Old Shredder. And that card obviously sounded very exciting, just the thought of it, right? It spawns a legendary on Death Rattle and things like that. But then a lot of people, when they first tried it with GVG, felt that maybe it was a little bit too slow. And how do you feel about that?
I definitely think that, you know, that's a card that's definitely a big question mark in my Priest deck right now. One thing that I like about it is that it is a large endgame minion that's powerful against decks like Warrior, because, you know, it requires them to grind through multiple bodies to actually kill it. It's also not vulnerable to Big Game Hunter, which is one of the flaws that a lot of the expensive sort of finisher minions like Ragnaros run into. So it's definitely, you know, a question mark in my mind. I've actually considered playing like Foe Reaper because, you know, sometimes you're playing Priest. It's like I want to clear my opponent's board, and you have this huge healable minion that's not vulnerable to Big Game Hunter that can very easily just mow down your opponent's board. So I'm experimenting with various stuff, but Sneed's what I'm sort of on right now.
Right on. Yeah. The Big Game Hunter, of course, another discussion in its whole right, because of the return of a lot of these legendaries with 7 or more damage, like you said, Foe Reaper. Their Neptulon for Shamans now coming in with 7 damage. Dr. Boom himself being 7/7. And then with the appearance of handlocks, I mean, this is something I discussed with Blackout last week on Tabletop. It will probably see more BGAs come by, and that will start to recycle which legendaries show up in each of the decks. But how do you feel about that, Kaldi? Do you think Big Game Hunters are going to make a little bit of a bigger, more common return on ladder, at least, kind of being included in almost every deck?
It depends a lot on the format. I feel like if it is a ban, you're probably going to be banning handlock and not seeing a lot of BGH. It seems strongest in Druid at the moment, I've found, but a lot of them aren't over 7 attack or 7 or more. It feels, you know, Dr. Boom definitely being the biggest one, the most common 7 attack minion there. Feels like, though, going off Sneeds as well, Ysera becomes a big, you know, fighting with that 8 or 9 mana spot, and I actually prefer Ysera to Sneeds because it's less random. I guess it's still a bit random.
Ysera is really vulnerable to Shrinkmaster plus.
Oh yeah.
That's very true.
That's actually the big reason. Like, I was super high on Ysera for a long time. It was my favorite finisher in Priest decks, but the vulnerability to that is just so massive that you basically have to play around additional copies of Mind Control coming for your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's only really relevant in the Priest Mirror match, but it can definitely be a big deal.
You'd be surprised how often the Tyrion gets stolen as well. I've had that happen to me quite a few times.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I heard about it so much that I couldn't believe that it was happening so often. But I think people are just so aware of the fact that you can do it now, and that answers so many questions for Prius against Paladin, right? It's like, oh well, you know what? I'll just use everything else for board clear, and then I'll take the Tyrion, and that's pretty much game over. So the Shrinkmeister has a lot of work.
I think Ysera doesn't really. You'd need to have a lot of early minions that could be Cabalt. So kind of force the guy not to save everything for the super late game because maybe they're not expecting any Serra since it's not common on ladder at the moment. But yeah.
Right. Right on. Right on. You know, I actually we'll talk about the Paladin here a little bit before we go to a break, and then come back to some of the other cards I want to discuss. But for Paladin, so we talked about it. We saw it earlier. Muster for battle, bringing in a new phase of Paladin. But before this, right, for a while, Paladin was still considered kind of a go-to class for counters, for counter control in tournaments for quite some time, especially in the spring and the early summer. Now, I see some people still tweaking control Paladin. Do you think that control version will also start to come back? And for the aggro, let's go a little bit more in depth. I talked about this earlier with you guys. Is it here to stay, or is this just kind of, I hesitate to use the word, but kind of a gimmick that people are working with in the first week of GVG?
I think go ahead.
Go ahead.
Kaldi, why don't you go first?
It feels like the shield bot is just so strong in the Master of Battle, also good in control matchup. So I think it will stay like that. We'll probably see more and more late game cards added in, over the time, just to kind of combat the mirror matchups, But I think the early game will stay about the same. I'm not sure the uber late game with 2 pyro monsters and a lot of late game cards will be the best way to counter control. It feels like possibly Freeze Mage is better at doing that, But yeah, it's hard to say though. I think if I was gonna be countering, let's say, Warrior or Priest, I wouldn't really be going for Paladin, I'd say.
Yeah,
I mean, what about you?
I think that the cards in the good cards from GVG and Paladin aren't really gimmicks at all. They're just fundamentally strong.
Right. Yeah. That's why I hesitate to use the word.
Right. Yeah. And there are ways to play them that have synergies that make them more powerful. You can play an aggressive Paladin deck that plays Knife Juggler plus Muster, which is super powerful. You can play a more controlling Paladin deck that uses Muster to trade with early minions, and then also has it as an option for a powerful board presence later on in the game with Quartermaster. I mean, when we were playing earlier on tabletop, the Muster into Quartermaster turn 8 was just this huge board presence that I ultimately couldn't deal with. And you have, it's the sort of card in particular in combination with Quartermaster that allows you to take a bunch of different angles of attack, which is often the sign of a card that is really strong.
All right. Yeah. Again, that's why I hesitated to use the word. It's just a lot of people in the beginning, right? They were just like, well, I'll just do that and then use Quartermaster. That's my go-to. But like you said, actually, of course, as the game develops, that just provides more options rather than that just being a go-to kind of like killing blow or the lethal for any Paladin matchup. But before we talk about more stuff, I definitely want to talk about Undertaker. We discussed that earlier. And then, of course, we have a slew of other things to discuss for Hearthstone, especially the Android release just having happened over the last couple of days. So we'll take a short break, everyone, and we'll be back to discuss Undertaker, some more cards that have changed the GVG meta, and then jump to a little bit more of the game features that have been happening recently. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of Turn 2. Today, episode 40 here with Brian Kibler and Kaldi from Fnatic. And we were just discussing some of the meta that seems to have settled, at least for the first week of GVG. Now, in part 2 here, I want to take a little bit of a step back in Hearthstone history and go back to a card that's still in the spotlight, the Undertaker. Now, with the release of Nax, of course, this card drew a lot of attention and pretty much changed the way Hunter was played. It changed how strong Hunter was, and Zoo too, right? Zoo with the Nerubian eggs and things like that. And we do have some cards that are specifically designed to combat Death Rattle, but I haven't really heard any discussion on those cards, such as Little Exorcist. I want to see your takes on, first of all, Undertaker. Is it maybe still too prominent in GVG?
I think Undertaker is a card that definitely warps the way that games are played and that decks are built. I think that, one of the reasons that I actually was drawn to a couple of the different decks that I was initially building for GVG was because I felt that both Undertaker and Mech Warper would be game-defining early minions, and I wanted to have tools that enabled me to be able to deal with both of them. And that was actually a big part of the reason that Mage was one of the Mage and Shaman were the two mech builds that I went to first, because I have cards like Rockbiter, Undertaker, and Frostbolt. And even with those, you can certainly still have games your opponent plays an Undertaker, then plays 2 Death Rattle minions on turn 2. Because GVG also brought with it Clockwork Gnome, which is another
Yes.
high-quality 1-cost Death Rattle minion. So, while there are cards like Little Exorcist and Scarlet Purifier, I think that it's much more important to just be able to deal with the Undertaker itself before it gets out of hand.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's not, in the end, it's actually not dealing with the Death Rattle cards once they're on board. It's, if anything, preventing them from happening on board. But what's your take on the situation, Kaldi, with the Undertaker?
I was also looking at that because there's a lot of synergy with for example the Mechanical Yeti that's Death Rattle and Mech. The Shredders are all both Mech and Death Rattle. So I was looking at that. For example, the Priest with the heal bot for 5. That felt really strong, but in the end, it just I don't know. I kept going back to the old minions. I feel like Zombie Chow is so much better as a 1-drop, and I guess the Haunted Creeper being just so much more sticky than the Mech Warper feels. So I keep going back to those minions. Another example would be the Dark Cultist versus the Spider Tank, which seems it just seems better. So for Priest at least, it doesn't seem to work with the Undertaker, but yeah, I don't think it's as much of a problem now that you have more reliable ways to deal with it. The big problem was that Mage and Paladin just didn't have a good way to deal with it. It just felt like the early minions just didn't work out really. So they have fixed that kinda. I still think Undertaker is strong, but it's mostly, I guess, in the very aggressive decks now. Yeah.
Right on. So, kind of piggybacking on what you just said, then would you say that maybe the card strength is still there and the direct counters haven't come up, but just the sheer variety of cards now we have at our arsenal and the variety of cards we're going to see from the opponents have maybe lessened the impact of Undertaker in Hearthstone?
I mean, I think that people, they know that they have to deal with that. And Undertaker and Mechwarper both present a pretty significant and similar problem, which is, okay, if you don't deal with a 2/3 creature early in the game for like 1 or 2 mana, you will very likely lose to it. Because they're both very similar. If Mechwarper survives for a turn and allows you to play multiple discounted mechs, you end up, potentially snowballing the board and getting into a position where, barring some sort of really powerful board clear, your opponent just can't win. And Undertaker is very similar in that if it lives through, the sort of its first turn in play and gets to grow, further, it is very, very difficult to actually ultimately deal with. And I think you see a lot of just good decks have, and players who are aware of, how they need to play matchups. They'll include cards like Frostbolt and Lightning Bolt and Wrath and, Fiery War Axe, and they'll mulligan very aggressively to those in the matchups where they're important.
Absolutely. And Kaldi, as you were mentioning, of course, mechs now, there's quite a few mechs that have Death Rattle. And that was one of the issues that people brought up with the Hunter after Nax was that, well, now the Beast plus Death Rattle synergy is just too good to ignore. And that's why Hunter is getting so strong. But with mechs, it's a lot of the neutral cards, right? The neutral mechs that have this Death Rattle effect. So do you think this is also just opening up a simpler, more straightforward aggro opening for a lot of other classes away from Hunter?
I don't know. It seems like aggro isn't what's winning now. It's more pressure, I guess. Like if you really want, cards, I guess, like Leper Gnome are becoming quite less common. You have the hero power, for example, with Mace just completely shuts down the Wolf Rider. Arcane Golems are becoming very rare. So it feels like aggro is almost phased out of the meta at the moment. I'm seeing almost no aggro decks, but definitely like. It comes down to a lot with the Mechanical Yeti and the what is it called, the Shredder there.
Yeah.
I honestly feel like the Shredder is just better with that. Yeah. But onto the Undertaker a bit, like it feels like Paladin has all of the answers to it. I'm seeing myself using turn 2 Owl or turn 1 with Coin even on an Undertaker quite often, and just that seems to be the end of it. Or you have an Aldor or so many other options. Also, I think the early weapons play a big role. There's so many more early weapons now that really counter aggro.
There's also just early minions that can fight with Undertaker. Like for instance, one of the biggest advances in when I was working on the Mech Mage deck, improving it, was adding Cogmaster as a 1-drop. And it's sort of, it's looking back, it seems kind of obvious. It's like, oh, you have a Mech deck, Cogmaster's good. But, a lot of people's early reviews of Cogmaster is like, oh, it's too easy to kill the mechs. It'll just be a 1/2, it'll die. But the biggest thing is actually not just Cogmaster's ability to attack as a 3/2, but its ability to pressure Undertaker, so that if you play first and you play Cogmaster and your opponent coins out Undertaker Death Rattle minion, Cogmaster becomes 3 power and can attack and kill Undertaker. And that's a huge deal in terms of the tempo play against the Death Rattle deck.
That's true. Yeah. I guess anytime new cards come out, I mean, it's the same with the original Hearthstone release, right? We can go back and look at a lot of even legendary cards, such as Nat Pagle, even Leroy. A lot of them are kind of undervalued because of what we just saw on paper in the beginning. But like you're saying, then the meta develops, and you're like, well, actually, this gets full value if it trades 1-for-1. That's fine. But the Undertaker probably actually is more valuable as it ramps up. So that's a better trade for me. It's really something to talk about. I want to go back to something Kaldi mentioned was the owl, and in general, silence. We didn't necessarily get like more silence cards, but because everyone's so concerned with putting mechs in their decks, we're actually seeing people take out the owls in the very beginning, like couple days of GVG, right? We're seeing people take out owls, taking out spellbreakers, and that seemed to cause people a lot of trouble in dealing with actually these new other mech cards. What do you think about the state of silence right now in Hearthstone?
It feels to be somewhat centered around one minion, Sylvanas. Do you have it? Can you deal with it? So it's also, I guess, decent as a tempo card, and I think people should not be afraid of using that as a tempo card early on. But yeah, I'm not sure which cards actually need the silence. I'm feeling like Druid needs the silence a lot. I guess decks that are kind of ahead usually on board, really need to be able to deal with Sylvanas. We had, for example, in the game in tabletop, he played out his Sylvanas against my Paladin. I didn't have an answer for it, and I would have lost that game if I didn't finish immediately. So, that could have gone very wrong, it feels. But yeah, I think overall though there isn't as much silence focused as it used to be. We are seeing more of the what is it called, the Veiling Souls, the 3/5 that silences all the friendly minions. Yeah, that seems
Soul,
decent.
Yeah, I mean, silence is a weird mechanic because it basically removes all the fun from cards. And I see lots of people, asking, oh, well, these cards like Undertaker are really good, so why don't we get more silence cards, whatever. But if there are just a bunch of good silence cards, then all that ever matters on your cards are their stats. And that's just, the abilities on cards is a lot more fun than, just the numbers on them. And I think that if we saw like a lot more cards like Ironbeak Owl, like Spellbreaker, that just were good enough to show up in decks, that, cards like Sylvanas that you were talking about, it's like, well, that just never has an ability because it always gets silenced. So I think that it's in a good spot, and I do think that we'll see more sort of decks. It's like, okay, I need to be able to deal with this, so I'm going to play Ironbeak Owl, I'm going to play Earthshock, or maybe even the actual card Silence in a priest deck, in order to deal with those things, rather than them just being sort of generically good things that go into every deck because every deck has targets for them.
I feel like especially before Miracle was figured out, I think that was kind of the best state of the meta. People were playing the mind control a lot in Priest. It was a lot of late game Druid, so you had a lot of synergy, with Big Game Hunter versus Rag. You had the Black Knight versus the Ancient of Wars, So you had a lot of the Silence versus, Cairn or Sylvanas. So there was so many back and forth you had to save for the right time, or you just lost the game. And that feels very, very strong, Especially, like, it only really boils down to that in I guess, the mirror matches, like Warrior versus Warrior always goes down to it. So many of the other mirror matches just comes down to who gets the better, 10 cards, and gets a better hand on board. So I really missed that interaction.
Yeah, that's something we talked about on tabletop too earlier, how now the damage threshold, ever since Miracle, right, has just started to go higher and higher. It's like, well, now I have to, if I'm playing against Rogue, I have to watch out starting at 20 health. And now with like Tinker's Sharpsword Oil, it's like, well, now I could even take 22 damage in one turn. And there are these things. Now, to some extent, with Miracle, of course, you can argue, well, then there's the whole calculation of you have to look at their hand size and whatnot. But I agree with what you said, Kaldi. I want to hear what you have to say about that, Brian. The fact that now it's more a lot of, I guess, preemptive playing and calculating, whereas before it was, I'll counter your card with this, and then you continue to counter each other and see who can choose the better card rather than just trying to play a guessing game on their hand.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of cases the sort of tactical play of sort of aggressive decks against one another is kind of underrated. People view, oh well, this control matchup, is more complicated basically because there are more turns in it. But in aggressive decks against other aggressive decks, or in aggressive decks against control decks, because you have a shorter window of time and you're making less decisions, each individual decision can often be more important and more impactful in the game's outcome. And if you sort of just recognize that, okay, I need to save mind control until my opponent plays mind control, or until my opponent plays Ysera, you have a lot of nothing happening, and that's not very fun. And I don't know that necessarily there's sort of more strategy there, especially once you just sort of know the formula. It becomes pretty much the same.
All right. Now, there's plenty of more cards and whatnot I want to talk about, but we might have some time actually, since we started earlier, to take some questions from the chat or even social media about maybe cards and meta questions they have. But right now, I want to make sure we cover some other things that have been happening in Hearthstone. So we'll jump right to the biggest news. It's, of course, Android was released. Now, I guess the first question would be if either of you guys have had a chance to try it on an Android tablet. I personally have not, but have you guys?
I have not, but I have been playing on my iPad a ton, and I actually this is a bizarre statement, but I actually think that my new iPad may be the best fitness investment I ever made, because I just take my iPad to the fitness center and just play games while on like the stationary bike or the elliptical or whatever. And before I know it, like 45 minutes have gone by. I'm dripping sweat, and I've gone up a few ranks. So it's it's pretty sweet, I have to say. And having access to a game as engaging as Hearthstone on mobile devices is pretty great.
Yeah. What about you, Kaldi? Have you had a chance to try it on Android tablet or?
I haven't tried on Android, but there were a lot of tournaments during the summer, especially sponsored by Vigame, and you had to play on those on the iPad, especially DreamHack Summer for one, DreamHack Valencia as well, and it's definitely a different metagame. There's, I guess, the miracle, for example, when you're playing 8 or 9 cards a turn, it becomes quite tricky. But I really like the idea, especially for arena or just random ladder. But for tournaments, it seems iffy. I think the worst case was when you were playing on touchscreens without the, I guess, the built-in thing we have for iPads and Android, where, let's say, for example, if you play, an SI7, you drop the SI7, then all the minions pop out, and then you choose which one by clicking on him. But if you are playing on a touchscreen computer, you don't have that option. You have to play it like you're playing a mouse, and that becomes very challenging. But I'd say for tournaments, definitely not. But for practice ladders and traveling, it's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually,
go ahead.
No, I was playing on my old iPad for a while, and I basically couldn't play Shaman on it because casting Lightning Storm just completely froze my entire iPad. So you definitely need a certain quality of tablet before it will function properly, especially with any of the graphics-intensive cards.
Yeah, that's been a discussion, especially with Android, and I think people are now seeing why maybe Android, with any application, tends to take longer, is because you have a wider array of, I guess, tablets that you have to deal with, and then when we go to phones, even a wider array of phones that you have to deal with when it comes to Android.
I mean, as I mentioned, earlier, my company, makes games, and we make games for both iOS and Android devices, and the range of capabilities that you have to program for and be able to support for Android is way bigger.
Yes.
And in many cases too, like the Android, despite there being more devices, the actual Android market of people who play games and buy apps and stuff is smaller than iOS overall, at least in terms of how much they actually buy and how much they spend. Certainly, that's the reason you see stuff like Hearthstone coming first to iOS before Android, because it's both easier and generally more profitable. So.
Yeah, I remember because I was interning at a startup for a mobile app, and it was always like, well, iOS first. Like Android is just way too much to consider. I mean, the market, iOS is simpler plus quicker to do, and like you said, generally larger, even to this day. And so, now that it's out, a lot of people are saying, well, my Android tablet, it's like 2 years old, but it's seeming to have some issues with the graphics, and then some people are having like sizing issues, and this is all stuff, of course, Blizzard is getting feedback on, but I think the realization is hitting that, what, well, Android, there's just much more to deal with from the designing standpoint, and thankfully Blizzard's taking the time. Personally, I'm very interested in how this works out in especially Korea, because Korea, a lot of people do have Android tablets, Samsung being like that main company, over iPads, and I'd love to see if this kind of bolsters the Hearthstone community in Korea, because it did have a slower start than most regions. But that's time will tell for that one. Now, with the Android news out and GVG, now we're seeing also a lot of discussion on newer players trying to join in on Hearthstone. The GVG hype was pretty big, and now with Android, people are like, well, you have an Android tablet, so now you can try it. You don't have an excuse, right? You can't be like, well, I don't have an iPad. Like, just install it, give it a whirl. And let's go right to the biggest question. Gold gain, right? Building out your collection. With GVG, a lot of people were concerned that it's going to be way harder and it's just going to kind of bar new players from wanting to join in. But on the flip side, as we've discussed, a lot of these decks, whether high-end like Control, so high dust value like Control Warrior, or low like Zoo, they only really switch out 1 or 2 flavor cards, right? And then you still kind of stay in the relative similar dust value. You still have the same style of deck. Do you think this expansion and the way they're dealing with the release of it is going to make it harder for new players to join in? Or would you say, dust value is relatively similar, I think it's going to be okay?
I mean, my fiance actually started playing pretty recently, and she's been going through the sort of free to play, trying to go through and win cards to slowly improve her decks through Arena. And I mean, the thing is that for players who are new and just sort of getting involved at the baseline level, as long as the most important thing isn't actually even necessarily the acquisition of cards, but it's the matchmaking. It's ensuring that you're actually playing against other people who have like similar qualities of decks to you, similar who basically are just on your same level. And you can do that in Arena pretty much indefinitely, because everyone has the same sort of cards to choose from.
Right.
So I mean, I think that while the acquisition of cards for new players is certainly a challenge for any sort of game as it grows and there's more content, I think that Hearthstone has a big enough player base that you're going to have enough new players that most new players will have other opponents they can play against, and even if not, you can play in the Arena and generally be on relatively even footing with other people. And frankly, when it comes down to it, you can also just spend a few dollars. I mean, Hearthstone doesn't exist because everyone plays for free.
That's true. How do you feel about that, Kaldi?
Well, it's a bit tricky. I think the problem now is how many legendaries there are in the new set compared to, I guess, more standard and rare cards. It felt, opening a lot of packs in when the expansion came out, that you got all the neutral cards immediately, and often more than 10 of each, But you were missing half of the legendaries. So I think, I don't know, it seems like the ratio of legendaries to non-legendaries was so different from the classic pool. And I think that's something they may need to look at to make it more accessible to newer players. But overall, you don't need a lot of the legendaries. It feels, you get Dr. Boom and you're pretty much okay.
Yeah. Yeah. For instance, we discussed, there's pretty much like 2 that everyone's focusing on. And then we talked about Sneed's possibly having a place because of its body value, the stats. Now, of course, along the lines of new players and how they gain the cards, the Arena change was a big deal for a lot of people, that you will automatically get those the GVG packs, rather, excuse me. And you mentioned this earlier, Brian, about how, well, even that one selection choice, it can be a little bit, it can start to stack up for like completely new gamers even, where they're like, oh, well, now I have to like choose this deck if I want to keep playing like Arena, or this pack. And then like I have to go to my collection and I have to like build a new deck if I want to play ranked. Do you think this is a legitimate concern that Blizzard rightfully kind of looked into?
I do, for sure. I mean, in particular for a newer player who is interested in perhaps optimizing their building their collection, and it's like, okay, well, which of these am I more likely to get cards that I want from? And that requires them to have some sort of knowledge of what okay, well, I don't know what cards are in this set. I don't know what cards are in this set. How am I supposed to choose? They don't even have the information available to them, through the client easily to make that kind of decision. So I think that, the fact that you can choose to spend your gold on whichever pack you want, that's fine. But the arena, providing, because it's this sort of experience that is in a lot of ways aimed at new players, because it's this sort of baseline, everyone's in the same footing experience. I think that it's pretty important that it doesn't have this sort of additional level of analysis paralysis. You already have a lot of tough decisions picking your cards in Arena, especially as a new player. having a tough decision at the end of, oh God, what do I get now? I think is not really something that is really necessary.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the fact that to make that selection, you would need to know the whole collection of cards to make an educated selection rather than just guessing or, kind of eeny-meeny which pack you want to open off of Arena. So that's another point that perhaps was overlooked by a lot of people who expressed concern. But what are your thoughts, Kaldi?
I think one thing playing into that, if it would be optimal to be able to choose, but it feels like if the Arena packs you get at the end, are becoming such a big portion of your gold intake, compared that it actually starts to matter. I mean, you could technically just use all your gold on classic packs and get the Arena packs with goblins and gnomes. But if you are doing it, if you have playing so much Arena that actually it matters which type you get, it seems that you aren't playing a lot of constructed, so you don't really need as many cards. But in general, it would be much more ideal to have be able to choose that in the end.
Right on. And like you mentioned again, another option is the whole gold gain, right? So if you want to get classic packs like straight up rather than dusting and enchanting cards, crafting cards rather, you have to just buy a classic pack. And for those who want to try to remain completely free to play, or they've only spent a minimal amount of cash, you have to rely on the gold gain. So people have been discussing, well, maybe the gold gain now is becoming a little bit too small. And this was something they tweaked a lot in beta, I remember, right? In alpha and beta, they went back and forth between, well, how much gold do you get per game? How much gold do you get for quests? And their original method seemed to work fine. Blizzard's original method seemed to work fine for the original release, but now with GVG, it changed, and people are saying, should we have bigger quests, maybe longer-term quests that are just automatically built into your profile? What are your thoughts on that? And for us, I mean, all three of us, clearly, we've put in the investment to experiment with all the cards. We have our collections. But from us looking at perhaps new players who are struggling to get this, is the gold gain good, and would that benefit us in some other ways too?
I think a bigger player pool would definitely be very beneficial to the game. I think one thing playing in is I don't know, especially preparing for tabletop. I played a lot of casual games, I guess, not the unranked ladder, I guess, and that feels like a great way to actually get your quests done each day. Like just pop onto the unranked one and play a few fast games and you can get it sorted instead of actually having to mess up your ladder rank or having to make a new deck for that particular class or bounce the quest, I guess, which happens. So I think that definitely plays in, but it would be more ideal for sure to just get a bit more gold with the new packs, it seems. Yeah.
I mean, I think that anyone's going to say, oh yeah, I'd love to get more stuff for free.
Well, true.
Yes, that would be, as a player, I would enjoy getting more stuff for free. That's just going to be the case. I mean, as someone who's worked on free to play game systems, one of the important things is that you actually provide the appropriate sort of incentives between, okay, how much you get for free and how much is your time worth? If it's like, is it worth, if I can accelerate my collection by X amount, how much am I willing to spend for, say, a day's worth of free currency gain, 2 days worth, a week worth, a month. And, that has to be an attractive ratio for anyone to ever want to spend money in your game. So, while, yeah, I do think that as for people who don't want to spend any money, sure, it'd be great to get more stuff for free. But, again, Hearthstone exists because they want to make money. Blizzard wants to make money with it. And of course, they're making a lot of money with it. And that's great, because it's great to see all this sort of infrastructure built up around Hearthstone with esports and everything. But it's important to keep in mind that only exists because people do pay money. And, I probably have a different perspective that a lot of people do on this because, I do work as a game designer on this sort of thing. But, I think that it's not necessarily just, people want more stuff, they should just get more stuff.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there is that fine line that you have to provide enough incentive that people who, even if you don't spend the big bucks, right? Maybe it's enough incentive that a free-to-play player is like, well, once a month, maybe I can buy a pack with cash. Like that's my treat for just like playing this.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important that the person who isn't paying money is able to have a good experience. That's sort of the baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, like
Yes.
and for, you know, for this specific example, you know, I actually played totally for free for, you know, my first like 6 months or so playing Hearthstone. All I did was play Arena and, you know, just built up packs doing that. Eventually opened those packs and built some decks. I, you know, made Legend in my first month without having spent any money on the game, just with the packs that I opened from doing arenas. And then I decided that I wanted to play more competitively and I wanted to have more options when building decks. So I spent some money and bought some packs. And I think it's a pretty, you know, it's a pretty normal experience people will have. Obviously, the rate at which you're actually gaining packs through Arena will vary dramatically based on how often you're winning in Arena. You know, I know that, you know, my fiance, who's been playing and sort of starting to play recently, you know, her win rate in Arena when I'm not helping her is not quite good enough to sort of go infinite and just keep playing.
Right.
But she's still having fun, you know, and she'll, you know, even outside of the times when she has enough gold to do another arena, you know, she'll just go and do play mode to get, you know, finish her quests or to, you know, get a couple extra, you know, wins to get some more gold. And as long as that's an experience that's fun for people, I think that the game is in you know, a great position. Again, that matters a lot about how the matchmaking works. And, you know, if you're just always getting paired against people who have, you know, complete legendary decks, you know, in normal play mode, and you're a free-to-play player who isn't really winning that much, like that can be a problem, you know, because you're not really having fun then, because you're just losing to all these cards. But, you know, if you're getting paired against people who you have a reasonable win rate against, like, it's not a problem. You know, if you get to the point where you're like, okay, I want to be able to build all these decks and compete with everyone, you know, yeah, maybe you'll need to spend a little money and buy some packs. If you want to be able to do everything the game has to offer, yeah, you'll probably either have to spend a lot more time or spend a little bit of money. And I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah, I would agree. What about you, Kaldi?
I have like a completely different background in Hearthstone. Like I started off just buying a lot of packs that I needed. I'm playing almost no arena. I've never got 12 wins. I think my best is like 8 or something. So I play almost no arena.
Night, by the way.
Sorry, what was that?
my fiance got 9 last night, so she's ahead of me.
Well, I'm with Kaldi.
Definitely.
I'm with Kaldi. I'm behind her too.
I might have been helping her a little bit, but
I'm like 80% custom games actually. I think I'm one of the pros that plays the most custom games and practice because you can just get more out of it for your time. It feels compared to ladder. So I have no golden heroes on either my account. I'm not only close on Hunter, I guess, but in general, yeah. So it gives a lot of different opportunities to players that want to do different things. It feels, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, along the lines of quests, actually, I want to go back to something I just remembered that was brought up, I think, earlier in this week, was that what kind of quests are kind of interactive and valuable for especially new players, right? So people who play well, right? This was on the note of quests that required winning. For players who are good, even obviously you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, but you have the faith that you can pick up a hero and you can win that number, whether it's in casual or ranked, and just get that daily gold. But for new players, it's like, oh well, like now I have to learn Mage in order to get like this gold, and I have to play at least like 5 games, but probably more to learn it. Do you think these quests maybe add a little bit too much negativity for the newer player experience, whereas they don't really gain too much from the very experienced players because they probably have a full collection anyway?
I think they actually did a really good job of making the quests. There's two key components, I think, in terms of the win quests that make them work really well, in my opinion. One is that you know you can abandon quests and get replaced by new quests once a day.
Yeah.
And two, I actually think it's a good thing that the quests potentially encourage you to experiment with new decks and new classes. It aids in sort of the discovery mechanism of Hearthstone. And for new players who you know they may build like a druid deck because they played a druid in WoW, and then it's like they get a quest. It's like, okay, win with rogue or warrior. It's like, well, okay, I'll go try rogue in this arena this time because I have a quest for it. And I think that diversifying your experience that you have as a new player, I think, is pretty valuable. And you don't have to do it. You can wait and abandon that quest until you get one that lines up with your classes that you do play. But it encourages you to sort of diversify, and I think that's interesting.
What about you, Kaldi?
It's quite funny. I actually didn't know you could complete quests in Arena. I've played that little Arena. I just know it's not possible in custom games, but I don't know. I'm
Right.
feeling like some of the quests kind of do the same thing. There's the, win 7, win 3, deal damage, play small minions. It feels like those kind that you just get ignored and you just play them anyway and get the gold anyway. And then it feels like there's, I guess the play above 5 minion or the 40 spell one, which often just get bounced. I'm feeling like, I don't know, at least, after the miracle nerf, it feels like that's just what's happening. But I think the class ones are quite interesting. You have to play a different class. I don't know. I think a lot of players are bouncing a lot of the quests, and I know that I'm at it, but I definitely like to see some new quests. They kind of need to mix the interactive ones and just the mundane ones where you just play the decks you're playing anyway. But yeah, I'd definitely like to see a few new ones.
Yeah, and perhaps that's something in the works, right? With especially expansions coming through, I'm sure there are more options. And something maybe we talked about earlier, Brian, where you mentioned like the types of cards, maybe like play a certain number of Murlocs, play a certain number of Pirates. Like that can be something that comes up. Perhaps frustrating for a lot of people, but it's something.
Those are weird because they're collection based. Like
that
win with
true.
an X number of games with X class. You can do that with just basic cards. But if you have,
Very
game,
true.
then you play X Murlocs, it's like, well, I don't own Murlocs, so how am I going to ever?
Yeah. Well, there we go. This is why I'm not sitting in Blizzard designing quests for Hearthstone. that would be.
I've thought
that would
about
be
a lot of
bit
these
an
kind
error.
of things before, so.
Right. No. That's why I'm glad that we have both of you guys here because we can get a little bit of different perspectives here than we might with some others that we commonly speak with, whether it's in the community or players. And that's a lot of the bulk stuff that I wanted to ask you guys today. And while we chat a little bit more, we have some time, so I want to kind of leave it up to questions to chat. There is a slight delay, so we'll let them kind of filter that through. You can type it in chat or you can tweet. We'll just use mine because I can't check everyone's Twitter at once, but you can tweet right below on your screen at me for some questions. And we won't be able to do all of them, probably maybe like 2 or 3, depending on the depth of the question. But I'd like to hear what the community wants to know. Now, so while we're waiting for those questions, with GVG now having come out, this is just a fun question, what kind of theme would you like to see for future expansions?
I mean, I played a ton of actual World of Warcraft back in the day. I actually, when the next expansion came out, or the next adventure came out, I actually went back and was rewatching my old guild's WoW, raiding videos from those encounters. I was like, oh, Patchwork, I remember that. I'll go watch me kill Patchwork. But I definitely think that something like a lot of the expansions that we already saw, like Burning Crusade would be a cool theme. I actually incidentally was head developer of the World of Warcraft trading card game, and that was like our second block was
Right.
Burning Crusade was the theme of the sort of group of expansions, and it was a lot of fun making cards with that sort of demon theme.
Right on. What about you, Kaldi?
I don't know. I'm kind of a fan of the pirate cards. I'd like a pirate themed South Sea type expansion, maybe with some more, I guess, fish type Murlocs added in there. So maybe pirates and Murlocs. I don't know. That'd be quite cool.
A ship
right,
theme,
yeah, ship theme.
Yeah, it's a water theme. We already have Neptulons.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, we've seen a lot of requests for the whole pirate and kind of expanding on that. So it was nice to hear your opinions on that. But we already have some questions coming in, and let's start with kind of a simple one we touched upon. So I think this will be a quick one where we can expand. Dr. Boom, is he too strong? Because he's kind of an auto include for a lot of cards that want to put in a GVG Legendary.
I don't think that he's too strong. I mean, I think that it's a fundamentally strong value card. It's not a card that you can't beat if it hits the board. I've certainly won lots of games where my opponent played Dr. Boom. I don't even have Dr. Boom in a lot of my decks. It's possible that's wrong. It's possible I'm making a mistake by not having it in my decks. I mean, it's a sort of thing that something becomes sort of popular opinion, and people just are like, oh yeah, it's too good, or it's the best, or and I'm not necessarily even convinced that Dr. Boom is the best legendary. It may be the best, the best neutral one, because many of the other neutral ones are, either unreliable or, aren't nearly so powerful when they hit the board. But yeah, I certainly wouldn't go so far to say it's too good.
I don't know. For me, at least, a friend of mine who plays this very casually, he felt that this was kind of the first instance where a card is just clearly better than equivalent card, and he was talking about the War Golem or what is called the 7/7 for 7,
Yeah, the
compared to that
War
with
Better
Dr.
than War
Boom.
Golem.
Yeah. This is clearly, there's no give or take. It's just better, So, but I'm not sure. I think the Lotheb is actually the strongest legendary at the moment, and I feel like, I don't know, Dr. Boom. It's on that tier with the top tier, I guess, with Tyrion and Lotheb, in my opinion. So yeah, that's my opinion. But I think those three are the ones that are a bit stronger than the rest.
Okay, well, thanks to Pyrofox for bringing that question up. I'm glad we could touch upon that card a little bit more. Let's jump around here, and let's jump to one actually geared a little bit more for you, Brian, but Kaldi, please feel free to chip in. Drewton wants to know, do you think Hearthstone will ever rotate cards like you did in Magic the Gathering? Do you see this happening in Hearthstone?
I think it's definitely something that's possible. I mean, for those who don't know, rotation is when certain cards are taken out of the pool of cards that are playable in competitive formats. And as we were talking about a bit earlier, while I mean, Magic has been around for 20 years, over 20 years, and there are cards that from the earliest years of Magic that are no longer permitted in tournaments at all, and some at least any sort of significant competitive tournaments. And then there are formats that use sort of smaller card pools and larger card pools. But there's one sort of core format, which is standard. And that's basically the past several years of cards. And we talk about card acquisition issues in Hearthstone. And if Hearthstone is around, say, 5 years from now, you certainly wouldn't imagine that people will be building decks from all of the cards that were ever released if they continue the pattern of the amount of cards they've been releasing recently. And I know that that's something they're experimenting with too, is how frequently and how many cards should they be releasing. And it's certainly, I've talked to some of the developers on the Hearthstone team, and they've said that the pace of expansions and how to handle adding additional content is something they're keenly aware of.
Kaldi, any thoughts on that?
I don't know. Looking at, I recently started to get into Magic a bit. About like 5 or 6 months ago, and it felt like at the end of it was about when Theros came out actually, and it felt kind of hard. Like you're buying, are you actually going to be investing in the block that's going out of it's going to become irrelevant in 6 months? Can you really deal with that? I think it's going to be kind of on a slower pace for Hearthstone because it's more casually focused, But I feel like Magic is more focused around having those new cards rotate, because you can't really hot fix a card, in Magic,
That's
with
true.
a patch, and I think that's the biggest thing. You can actually balance things a lot better in Hearthstone because it is online, so I think it's not as needed, the rotation. Yeah.
Well,
That's
rotation,
true.
I mean, rotation isn't necessarily just about cards being too good or too weak or whatever. It's just about like how many cards are in the format, period. Like Magic has like 10, 20,000 cards. And if you imagine that Hearthstone got to that point, would you really think that that it would be at all, especially given the team's sensitivity to the new player experience, is that, imagining that someone comes into the game and there's 10,000 cards and you can play with any of them at any time. It's like, that's just overwhelming. And that's the sort of thing that's really important to keep in mind as this sort of collectible game grows.
I think it's so much more rapid with Magic. I mean, you get 350 cards or 250 or something every 3 months, so it becomes a lot more needed, I guess, in Magic to be constantly rotating. But I feel like the Hearthstone expansions are quite slow, so I could see maybe rotation every 1 or 2 years might be doable. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. It's definitely a little bit of a ways down, even if it comes through for Hearthstone, but something to keep in mind for a lot of us. Let's jump back to something a little bit more, I guess, related to the actual meta and cards. And this is a card actually I would like to talk about. Tree of Life. Demonic GG wants to ask about Tree of Life. With the invasions of things like Mech Mage, do you think Tree of Life might be good, just so you can avoid dying to burn? Now, obviously, there's also the kind of fringe case of Tree of Life with Akanai, like if you thought steal it, but that's putting that aside for Druids, right? Is this a card that's maybe going to see more use just to counter out these burn cards?
It's hard for me to imagine that this is a card that gets a lot of play. 9 is a lot of mana, and I think that if you're playing a deck that's built to go to the really long game, you want your really expensive cards to be ones that actually win the game rather than just sort of make you not die. As much as my Dragon Master Druid deck is sort of a goofy, fun deck, I try to make it as competitive as possible within the constraints of, okay, I'm playing all these dragons. And, that's the sort of deck that, maybe you could include Tree of Life in it, but that's instead of some giant monster that's actually winning you the game. And I think that cards like Antique Healbot or Healing Touch, those are cards that, will keep you alive at the points in the game where you're really at risk. And then you really want your expensive cards to generally be the things that are taking over and dominating the game.
For me, it feels like it feels like Alex Strasza is 9 mana as well, and it does similar thing, but it gets you an 8/8 on the board, and it's more flexible. So I think, I don't know, it's really hard to see it. Tree of Life. It's you have to compare it with cards like, I guess, Lay on Hands. I think that's vastly superior to Tree of Life. I think also the Healbot is the neutral Healbot. It seems so much stronger, and I mean, healing a minion to full. If you look at what is called Ancestral Healing, that taunts the minion as well for 0 mana. At 0 mana, it gets barely any play at all. So at 9 mana to heal like this, it seems I mean, I would maybe consider that 9 mana if you get a 5/5 out of it as well. Maybe a 5/5 with taunt or something. That could be okay. But it feels like this card and the Cobra shot especially seem just way too expensive. I mean, I could see possibly at 6 mana, I could see playing Tree of Life.
People talk about win more cards that are only really good when you're actually already ahead. This is a lose less card. This is a card that you play and you're just no longer losing the game right away. And yes, there's certainly situations where you're going to win because you cast Tree of Life and gained 20 health off of it because your opponent was about to kill you. But in many cases, if you had a different card that you could play earlier that could help stabilize the board or remove a creature or whatever, it would have been more effective at actually keeping you alive and winning the game.
Very true. Let's jump to one last question, and we've had quite a few, so it's sort of pinpoint one, but I want to focus a little bit more on the meta since we've had a lot of good discussion there. Something that was brought up before GVG was released and when it was announced, does a Beast Hunter, this is from Mayshar, does a Beast Hunter have a place in this meta with the few that were added in GVG like Guzrilla and King of Beasts? I'm already a little bit skeptical about that part, the King of Beasts part, or is Undertaker Hunter still your only choice? What do you guys think? Of course, I think Beast, Kaldi, I think you touched upon that earlier about, Call Pet having a little bit of synergy there, but maybe not enough. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I've tried this out. I tried it out a few times. In my second game, I played against Blackguard, a practice game. I had 2 Call Pets, got both Savannah. So I had a turn 3 and turn 5 Savannah, which was definitely not bad. Then into a turn 8, I had a Web Spinner and got the King Crush out of that for turn 9. So that was, but even then, I was barely able to win, barely. And that feels like 1 in a million. So I think still the aggressive Hunter will be the way to go. It feels like Hunter is a bit, I don't know, broken at the moment. It feels like it needs some fixes, kind of like how Pala and Mage were, because the new cards are just so good against it. With the Shield Bot and the Traveler's or Zombie Chow, which is I guess not a new card, but been played more recently.
I think that for Hunter, the hero power of Hunter is so good in an aggressive deck at actually closing out the game that playing a deck that is not aggressive when you're playing Hunter just feels like a mistake. That's one thing that I think is sort of just a characteristic of Hearthstone, is that hero powers define classes pretty heavily. And like Warrior, for instance, you rarely see aggressive Warrior decks because the Warrior hero power is only good at keeping you alive or enabling Shield Slam or whatever. Similarly, most Priest decks tend to be board control decks because the heal ability is good at keeping you and your minions alive. And with Hunter, trying to play a sort of control Hunter deck, which is what sort of cards like Gazrilla and Call-Pet will often sort of drive you to do, just goes against the direction that the hero power is pushing you. And while there is like Steamweedle Sniper, that can give you a little bit of board control
About
from
to
your hero
say.
power. You know, your deck is only functioning in that way when you actually have the card in play. So if you don't draw it, you know, your hero power is only aggressive. So I think that, you know, because it's so good at being aggressive and so bad at doing anything else because the hero power doesn't affect the board, I think that you're generally going to see the best Hunter decks are still going to be aggressive ones, even with the new cards.
Yeah, very
I kind
good
of feel
point
like
about the
it's
hero.
I kind of feel like it's close to what Reaper Shaman was before. I tried that out a few times in tournaments, and it's okay, but it lacks that consistency really. I've seen Gara was actually playing in the King win a double Feign Death with like 2 Sled Belchers, 2 Shyvana, Cairn and Sylvanas, which seems kind of cool, but it's not as consistent, unfortunately. So you won't really see it at the top level at the moment. But maybe someone will be able to do something crazy with it. I'm looking at Sixo for that, definitely.
Yeah, the Feign Death, of course, another option that people are tinkering with. And like you said, while fun, especially for professionals, of course, and people who want to climb ladder, you got to go for the consistency. You got to get whatever gets you the wins in the end of the day. And maybe we're not just there yet with Hunter. And I think you brought up a good point, Brian. The hero power defines it a lot. And for Hunter especially, because you have no control over how it works, just like Warrior. It just works the same way every time. Whereas, for instance, Mage or Priest, at least you can target a couple of different options. So that's a very good point. I mean, thank you to the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to go through all the questions, but we are going to wrap up for today's episode of Turn 2. Of course, you guys can ask all 3 of us questions on social media at any time, or all 3 of us whenever we're streaming. You'll be able to find out. So if both of you guys want to give quick shout outs and just plugs for where people can find you.
Yeah, well, you can see on the screen, I'm on Twitter and Twitch, both as BM Kibler. I actually just recently started a daily stream schedule. This actually interrupted it. This is the first time I have not streamed during my scheduled time, but I decided to come out here. But I generally stream about 10 a.m. Pacific time on every weekday. I'll also probably be streaming quite a bit over this weekend at least. Probably going to be messed up a little bit with the holidays coming up, but trying to do this every day. Been having a lot of fun with it. So thank all of you who tune in to watch me, and I hope to see you in my stream soon.
All right. And Kaldi?
I'm streaming a lot on asubu.tv/Kaldi. I'm going full time now, so it's going to be a lot more streaming. It will usually be around 9 p.m. GMT, should be 10 p.m. Central European time. Going off that, I am starting out a video series on YouTube/Fnatic TV. Going to be doing some puzzles, some gameplay. Advice, I guess, and just some specific decks that I've been doing. I've been doing articles on Fnatic.com, going very in depth with how to play a deck, how the matchups work, and then there's also included just about half an hour of me playing that deck. So I just did one on a kind of a different mech mage with I guess a bit different to what Strife was playing. It has 2 Fell Rivers and a low step in there, but
yeah, Fell River.
So yeah, just I usually tweet out when I'm streaming, but it should be around 9 p.m. About 2 videos a week on Fnatic.tv and about maybe 1 article every 1 or 2 weeks on Fnatic.com. So check that out for sure.
Awesome. And for me, just like you guys, of course, for the viewers, right below on the screen, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. And I also stream daily, at least during the week, Monday through Friday. I guess it's Sunday through Thursday for Western time zones, but Monday through Friday there. So you'll be able to find me there. And I'll put up some blog posts now and then too, just like the other 2 guys, about my thoughts on what's going on. So you can find us there. I'm sure you can ask us questions and try to catch us, whether it's on stream or on social media, to answer more of your questions. Thank you to both of you, Brian and Kaldi, for joining me for both Tabletop and Turn 2 today. I think we had some great discussion. I loved hearing your thoughts on the meta and just the game itself, Hearthstone, how it's doing. So I really appreciate it. I'm sure our viewers do too. For all you viewers, thanks for tuning in for all 3 shows, Deck Wars, Tabletop, and Turn 2 today. This is Chobra, wrapping up Hearthstone and Machinima. We'll be back next week.